I'll start us off, and then Carol will join halfway through. Can you hear me? All right. So the genetics of familial polyposis. So when we say familial polyposis, what we're talking about, familial referring to our genes, it can run in the family, and then polyposis just referring to multiple polyps. Now polyps are non-cancerous growths in the body, and we're thinking here about specifically inside the gastrointestinal system. There are different types of polyps. One of those types is adenomas. Now, adenomas are a type of polyp that have a risk to become cancerous if they're not removed. So when we think about familial polyposis related to multiple adenomas, the two main conditions we think of are FAP and MAP, and that's where we're going to focus tonight. And I'll be talking about FAP, and then Kara will be talking about MAP. We're not going to focus on conditions involving different types of polyps tonight. So FAP, familial adenomatous polyposis. People who have the classic form of FAP will have hundreds or even thousands of polyps in their colon and rectum, and the onset can be as early as childhood or the teenage years. There can also be polyps in other parts of the gastrointestinal system, so the stomach, the first part of the small bowel, the duodenum, and there is a somewhat higher risk for other types of cancer, as we've learned, including thyroid cancer. Not going to get into it too much tonight, but it's also associated with other non-cancerous features, including non-cancerous desmoid tumors, which may be in the abdomen area, for example. A finding in the eyes that doesn't affect vision is sometimes called trypy, and osteomas, or bumps on bones, skin cysts, or even extra teeth. Now there's a less severe or milder form of FAP that we call attenuated FAP. People who have attenuated FAP tend to have fewer than 100 of these adenomas, these polyps, and the onset is often in adulthood. It's a later onset, milder condition. Both of these conditions are rare. We see them in about 3 in 100,000 people or so, and they're actually both associated with the same gene. That gene is called APC, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So just thinking of genes, genetics, now what we're talking about here. Our bodies are made up of cells, and inside of our cells we have our genetic material, our DNA. When we talk about doing genetic testing, we usually look at the DNA through getting a blood sample, so looking at DNA from blood cells. We have many genes, over 20,000. We know that they're written in a code, and when there's a change in the normal code that causes the gene to not work properly, we call that a mutation in the gene. So thinking about this APC gene, we know if somebody has a mutation, in just one mutation in that gene, it's enough for somebody to be affected with one of these conditions. We call it autosomal dominant inheritance, and we'll get into that a little on the next slide. And it affects males and females in equal numbers. Interestingly, the location along the sequence of the gene can be associated with whether a family has the classic form of FAP or attenuated FAP. And it tends to be consistent within a family. Now overall, we have 2 copies of essentially every gene. We get one from our father and one from our mother. So we get half of our genetic material from each parent. How this looks with inheritance. So this diagram is showing somebody on the left there who has one mutation in one of their 2 copies of the APC gene, and they would then be affected. So affected with FAP or attenuated FAP. Here we're showing that their partner does not have FAP. So their 2 copies of the APC gene do not have mutations in them. Every time they would go to have a child, they would pass on one or the other of those copies. So if the parent with FAP passed along a copy of the gene with the mutation, and the parent without always passes on a copy without, that child would inherit the condition. If the person with FAP passes on their other normal working copy of the gene, then that child would not inherit FAP. So as you can see, there's a 1 in 2 chance for each time somebody with FAP has a child, presuming the partner doesn't also have FAP, for that child to inherit the condition, but also for them to equally not inherit the condition. So now that we know the gene, if we're able to find that spot in the gene where the mutation is, then there's that blood test available, a predictive test. And people often ask, what age should somebody have a predictive test? Should they have that blood test? Usually it's around the age that screening would start for that particular condition. So for classic FAP, that might be around age 10 to 12 when screening starts. And for attenuated FAP, around age 18 to 20, so as an adult. Sometimes people will have FAP and their parents will also have FAP. This happens about 75 to 80% of the time. However, sometimes people have FAP and their parents do not have it. Sometimes we might call this de novo, where that change in the gene, that mutation, has happened new in them. And that actually happens about 20 to 25% of the time. So that's how we can have somebody with FAP whose parents do not have it. Now, if somebody has a genetic test and they are found that yes, they did inherit that same change in the APC gene, what does that mean? That would mean that they have inherited the condition, so they have FAP or attenuated FAP. Once we know that, then we would recommend screening. So as we said with the colon, screening usually starts around age 10 to 12. With attenuated FAP, that's often around 18 to 20, starting with maybe colonoscopies, but once there are too many polyps, which may or may not happen for attenuated FAP, to be managed by colonoscopy, then surgery might be recommended for them. An interesting point is that even after surgery, people are still recommended to continue screening if they have any remaining colon or rectum or even a pouch. We also recommend for people to have upper GI screening. So that's an endoscopy to look at the stomach and the first part of the small bowel. Usually that's from around age 25, sometimes it's done younger. And as I mentioned before about the increased risk for thyroid cancer, we now recommend for people to have their thyroid checked by their family doctor at their annual physical. Now, if someone has that genetic test, that blood test, and they're found not to have inherited that mutation, what does that mean? That means they do not have FAP or attenuated FAP. They then cannot pass the condition down to their children. They would be recommended to follow general population screening for cancer unless there's some other history in their family that's not explained by FAP. This underlines the importance of letting family members know about the condition in the family and the availability of this genetic test. It would really influence whether somebody is having screening, not having screening, if somebody is found to be at risk or not. So not just somebody's children, might be their brothers and sisters, their parents, or the more extended family. I'll invite Kara.
We're now going to switch gears a little bit and talk about another genetic hereditary polyposis condition called MUT-YH-associated polyposis, which stands for MAP. So when we compare MAP to attenuated FAP and FAP, we see that the clinical presentation is quite similar. So in both conditions, you see patients presenting with many adenomas or adenomatous polyps in the colon. The difference is that in MAP, there are additional types of polyps that we see sometimes, like hyperplastic polyps or serrated polyps, in addition to the adenomas. So it's a bit more of a mixed, mixed types of polyps that are seen. On average, we see approximately 10 to 100 polyps in patients with MAP by the age of 50. Again, that's on average. We also see patients with MAP who have less polyps than that, and also many more, like hundreds or thousands of polyps in their colon, similar to FAP. So that it can be quite variable in terms of the number of polyps. The gene is also different, so instead of the APC gene, as Laura discussed, MAP is caused by gene changes or mutations in the MUT-YH or MYH gene. So those are one and the same. The inheritance is also very different. So instead of a dominant genetic condition, as we saw with FAP, MAP is considered a recessive type of inheritance. So when we think about recessive inheritance, both parents are unaffected with the condition. So different from FAP, where only one gene mutation was required to actually have the features of the condition. In recessive inheritance, two parents each have one copy of a gene, and they're considered carriers for a gene mutation, but they're not affected with the condition. So that's the main difference from dominant to recessive inheritance. If both parents pass on their normal copy of the gene, the copy without the mutation, the child is unaffected with MAP and not a carrier of a gene mutation. So there's about a 25% chance, or 1 in 4 chance for this to happen. If a child inherits one mutation and one normal copy from each parent, they are a carrier just like their parents, and again they're unaffected with the condition. There's a 50% chance, or 2 in 4 chance for this to happen. So in order for a child to be affected with MAP, or for a person to be affected with MAP, both parents must pass on their mutation copy to their child. And when this happens, the child has 2 mutations and is affected with the condition. So in this case, MAP. So you don't see a typical pattern in the family of generation to generations of people affected with the condition. It tends to pop up new in a generation. So again, 25% or 1 in 4 chance if 2 parents are carriers of a gene mutation in the MYH gene that their child would have MAP. So this just reiterates that point, and also points out that siblings, brothers and sisters of someone with MAP, also have a 25% or 1 in 4 chance of being affected. So if somebody has MAP, there's a very small chance for their children to have MAP, as we just saw. It's only possible if their spouse or partner is also a carrier of a MUT-YH gene mutation. And this is quite unlikely. It's not that common in the population. It's about a 1% chance for someone to carry one copy of an MYH mutation. More likely, the partner would be unaffected and not a carrier of a gene mutation. And in this case, all of the children would be considered, they would be carriers. So they would inherit one mutation and from one parent and the normal copy from the other parent in all cases. So the children would all be carriers, but again, unaffected. So who should get genetic testing in a family of someone with MAP? The spouse or partner, if they're available. If they're negative, as shown in this diagram, and they're not a carrier, the children don't need genetic testing. They would all be assumed to carry a mutation. If the spouse or partner is not available or not interested in genetic testing, the children can certainly be tested just to make sure that they don't have 2 copies. Again, there'd only be a 1% chance that that parent would have been a carrier, but by testing the children, we could find out if they had MAP as well. Unlikely, but a possibility to do that type of genetic testing. Brothers and sisters, again, as I mentioned, of someone with MAP would be eligible for genetic testing. When it comes to screening for MAP, only people who have 2 copies of the gene mutation, again, are considered affected with MAP. They require additional screening, usually colonoscopy every 2 to 3 years, beginning at the age of 18 to 20, and then annually once multiple polyps are detected in the colon. This can vary if there's an earlier onset of polyps or cancer in a family member, but on average, this is what we recommend. We also suggest an upper endoscopy, as Laura mentioned, looking at the stomach and the top part of the small bowel. It's a special type of upper endoscopy called a side viewing upper endoscopy, and this is recommended every 5 years, or sometimes more often depending on the findings. It can range from every 6 months to every 5 years, depending if there are polyps seen in the upper GI tract. And this begins at age 25 to 30. So for people who are not gene carriers or have only one copy of a mutation, and again are considered gene mutation carriers, both scenarios are unaffected with MAP, and they're considered to be not at a significant increased risk for polyps or cancer. So we suggest following population screening, which can be arranged through a family doctor, unless there is another family history that's unexplained by the gene in the family. So to summarize, FAP and MAP both cause multiple polyps. The differences, again, being the gene that's involved, the types of inheritance, dominant versus recessive, and the different screening recommendations, subtly different for the two conditions. Genetic testing has improved over the years drastically, as Terry pointed out. It didn't used to exist at all, and we have over time improved the methods of genetic testing, as well as discovered the new YH gene even in more recent years. So you may be eligible for further genetic testing if you were tested many years ago, or if you have never had genetic testing and have a clinical diagnosis of polyposis, or if you have multiple polyps and had genetic testing where there were no findings. You may have been tested for only one of the two genes. So if you have questions about your genetic testing, your results, who in the family should be tested, screening recommendations, questions about when you're due for your next scope, things like that. As Zane introduced, the four of us were here for you. Talk to your genetic counselor, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.